So Ananya is from Sambulpur, Odisha. She studied a BA and MA in English and Foreign Languages at the University of Hyderabad, and she completed an MPhil in Modern South Asian Studies, and then later a PhD in English at Cambridge with a Gates Trust and a Cambridge Trust Scholarship. That's where I met her, and we were worked together on the conference that happened just before coronavirus. So it's very strange to finally be back in this room with Ananya after that. Well, you know, the pandemic is ongoing, but to finally be back together in person, it feels a bit surreal, actually. There's more to say though. Ananya has researched on transnational Indigenous literatures. Her paper titled A Crisis in Metaphors, Climate Vocabularies in Adivasi Literatures is published in Transmotion. That's a recent one in 2022, so this year. And she's the co-founder of Untold Histories Museum Tours and the Breadth Theatre and Film Company. She's based in London, where she works as a lecturer in the School of English and Drama at Queen Mary University in London. So if you could all join me in welcoming Ananya.
Thank you, Louis, for the kind introduction, and thank you to everyone at ISDG for organizing this conference. And thank you to the speakers and participants. It's been very enriching, for the past 2 days to listen and learn. I work in transnational Indigenous literatures. Mainly, I try to foreground Adivasi literatures and global Indigenous studies. And my particular context is in Eastern India. I'm from there, and I have worked mainly with Kondha communities, particularly in a village from Kuchaipadar. I myself am upper caste in India, so there is that power dynamic there while researching on Indigenous literatures in the UK. And we have been talking about particular contexts so much in the past 2 days, and my work in literature is to draw up the affinities across these differences. For this paper, I wanted to gather some resonances in how Indigenous writers have written about land ethics, the affinities that they may share, and some of the questions that come up while close reading these texts. So I look forward to your feedback and advice and links that you may have and readings that I should pursue. Firstly, I would like to quote words and ideas by some of the writers to identify some of the resonances as examples. Kiowa writer N. Scott Momaday reflects on an American land ethic in 2 essays. In his essay, A First American Views His Land, he reflects on the peculiarly native kinship of a Native American person to the American soil. The long tenure of habitation on American earth, a span of nearly 30,000 years, has needed a specific commitment to the landscape. And this commitment, he says, is based on a trust that is sacred. He frames this code of trust that is learned from stories and community elders as a moral imperative that is inescapable for survival. In his second essay, An American Land Ethic, he writes, there is no alternative, and here I'm quoting him, there is no alternative, I believe, if we are to realize and maintain our humanity, for our humanity must consist in part in the ethical as well as in the practical ideal of preservation. Inupiaq anthropologist and writer Herbert O. Anungazok wrote that an unwritten law binds the ecology of the Arctic, the sea ice, to the Inupiaq peoples. He wrote of this code as an alliance. He wrote, we have an alliance with the earth. Each one of us does. And some of us as a people have continued to grasp this alliance and have anchored into our minds and our souls. Leanne Betasamusaki Simpson writes about the relational philosophy of the Nishnabeg people to the land, or Aki, that this ancient code of ethics passed through stories is drawn from the earth. And in her chapter, Land as Pedagogy, she quotes John Burroughs, an Anishinaabe scholar, who writes, and I quote, and hopefully I'm pronouncing this correctly, Aki Numaji. Aki means earth, and Numaji means to point towards and take direction from. As we draw analogies from our surroundings and appropriately apply or distinguish what we see, we learn about how to love and how we should live in our lands. Later in their joint essay, Glenn Coulthard and Leanne Bertasamosaki-Simpson framed this code of ethics as grounded normativity, which is a form of deep reciprocity that teaches, and they write, that teaches us to how to live our lives in relation to other people and non-human life forms in ways that do not exploit or dominate other peoples and the land. In the Indian context, from Chhattisgarh, the late Orang scholar Abhay Khokar defined a philosophy of ecological ethnicism. And he wrote that it has been collectively articulated and carried forward by different Adivasi communities. In each of these articulations, there is a common resonance of a land ethic by which the community abides by, although in each of these cases, the relationship is particular and place-based. Most indigenous literatures are place-based, and our literary readings connect diverse philosophies of land ethics, which we as readers try to honor and read while offering a literary reading of a text. Some of these ideas are materially defined, like that of Leanne Bertasamosaki-Simpson, who writes about a form of Mishnah-bed pedagogy, while others like that of N. Scott Momaday write about a form of land ethics that is possible through an act of imagination. And we'll be coming back to the idea of imagination, I'm sure, with Jacqueline's talk as well. There are some unresolved questions that I have often thought about, but find it difficult to articulate tangible literary and methodological solution for, because many could be structural problems, many one of distance and access, and I think many others might require some collective thinking, and I take this opportunity to bring some of these queries together. In reading from the UK, we can acknowledge that land ethics are specific forms of practice and living embedded in Indigenous land. Our work on Indigenous literature is not simply textual in a sense. Like the literary material, our work in literary criticism attempts to be earthbound or ocean conscious, mountain owned, desert led or misled, glacier paced, forest hearted. In order to learn about the specificity of land ethics of a particular place and the ongoing land claims to sovereignty, we do indeed need to ponder on the remembered earth of the Indigenous writer in a way that is consensual and also not demanding of the land and planet through excess air travel. Coming from Eastern India, I am familiar to some extent, it's a lifelong learning, of course. I'm familiar to some extent with the geographies, the dongers and the malis, the mountains of Kond Adivasi songscapes. But I do admit that similar to this, my literary readings of ice or of American or Australian poetry relies on explanations that are generously provided by the writers themselves. And given I have not visited many of these contexts, my critical writing lacks the referential anchors of their poetry. And this is to some extent true of any literary reading done from any context. But given there is a particularity of land ethics that we are talking about within Indigenous studies, what are the ways in which literary readings from our context within the UK and Europe, or any other context that we might be working from, become more enlivened by the geography of the writer and that of our own? Reciprocity and pedagogy, and this is something that we have been talking about quite in depth in the last 2 days, so I think mine is a bare minimal attempt. In my attempt to learn about land as pedagogy that grounds itself in context and practice and process for my PhD thesis, I had asked Leanne Simpson whether one could learn a form of solidarity and learn about specific Indigenous knowledges that was not in ways extractive. She wrote to me about reciprocity as a practice of, and I quote her, building solidarity, a thinking through together. This is more a question to seek collective ideas about reciprocity, thinking through together, as Leanne says. The format of these past 2 days is perhaps a great one, and so is any collaborative thinking and work. And especially like the last keynote has provided some solutions as to how we do or we can practice reciprocity from this context. My difficulty is more in terms of pedagogical approaches within the classroom. What are the pedagogical approaches in the classroom through which we engage with context and practice-based land ethics while reading these texts? And part of teaching and learning in the UK is not just to correct asymmetries of knowledge within our institutions, which are implicated in histories of colonialism, but to let students think of land rights in different contexts outside the UK. And what is the thinking through together on a day-to-day basis in our classroom that this sort of exercise demands? The question of the land and the sacred. So just to give a context, in his article, Professor Brendan Hokowitu provides a reflective vision of the future of critical Indigenous studies and Indigenous futurities. And this vision is in his article in the collection Critical Indigenous Studies, Engagements in the First World, edited by Eileen Morton Robinson. And as the collection's name suggests, it is written from the context of First World locations. So Professor Hokowitu first identifies the dualities imposed upon Indigenous existence within discourse, first as dehumanized peoples in Euro-American history. And the fact that Indigenous criticism, to counter this, has to rely on secular terms to produce the legible Indigenous citizen, similar to post-colonial discourse. And both of this are formed by and rely on Western taxonomies. In order to break free from this double bind, Hokowitu talks about an insurrection of knowledge that are, quote unquote, unintelligible to the Western academy. He talks about an assertion of metaphysical genealogies, a reappropriation of Indigenous myth, and recoded so that there is no genealogical distance between nature, body, and knowledge. While reading this, I wanted to reflect on the context of India, because that's where my central focus on Adivasi literatures is from, and how this vision for Indigenous futurities might speak to institutions in India and to Adivasi land and ideas of the sacred. Like Professor Hokowitu's ideas and similar to Audra Simpson's ideas on ethnographic refusal, there are instances in Adivasi literatures that affirm refusal and the unintelligible to establish Adivasi sovereignty. So Hansdas Saubendra Shekhar's short story collection is one of such examples. And at the same time, embodied religious practices legible only to the members of a certain Adivasi community often occur simultaneous to wider protests during land rights movements. However, in Indigenous studies within the UK and in India, I do find myself wary while working on literary readings of Adivasi sovereignty based on ideas of the sacred and of myth. And this has more to do with the political landscape of the Indian nation state. Myth and the sacred are also the impositions of a virulent Hindu nationalist state. And mythology serves as the ground for competitive claims where the Hindu nationalist state can claim the grounds of the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya. And similarly, the current political order has undermined the institutions that safeguard Adivasi rights to land, sovereignty, and their religions. And it makes me wary to think whether only the insurrections of myth and the metaphysical can adequately seek to bolster Adivasi rights, given the widespread conversions to Hinduism and assimilations within the dominant order that is ongoing in India currently. And even for religious sovereignty, for instance, the codification of different Adivasi religions under the Sarna Code has had to rely on institutions. And therefore, I keep going back to the duality that Professor Hokowitu talked about, and going back to rely on the institutional secular in a way while talking about Adivasi rights. And at the same time, as a student of transnational literatures, I would like to understand what kind of dialogue can exist between these two diverse locales, where land ethics as embodied understandings and as a material claim can be discussed together without this gap of inequalities owing to the locale and the politics of a region. Finally, reading land ethics in literatures often includes reading articulations of indigenous humanisms or more than humanisms. This is not, of course, based on Enlightenment humanism or humanism with a capital H, or Euro-American studies of humanism as intellectual movements. As I think we will understand within this discussion, the critique of Enlightenment humanism in the work of several indigenous scholars is the basis of decolonizing discourse and our work in indigenous studies. And taking from the Jamaican writer Sylvia Wynter, herself a critic of humanism, her writing conveys a hope towards envisioning new forms of humanisms. And here, humanisms as conceived and articulated from the position of the Black and indigenous subject. And this begins after the rewriting of modern history as not the history of the human, but rather a project that dehumanizes indigenous and Black populations. So the way I use indigenous humanisms here is to read into those concerns about the human condition and visions for its future articulated from indigenous standpoints and positions. Writing about land ethics includes indigenous humanisms or more than humanisms as one where the human condition is entangled with the responsibility to land and or the planet. When asked about how Native American criticism has developed and its future, Acoma Pueblo poet Simon Otis identifies critical thinking, deep thoughts and ideas about ourselves and our relationship to others as central to Native American literary criticism in an interview in 2010. He writes, indigenous peoples are concerned, worried, in other words, about the human condition, society and culture, theirs as well as that of others, especially because their condition overlaps and intersects with the larger society and culture they are a part of. Indigenous peoples of the Americas who were and are the original human culture and society of this part of the world are deeply concerned. And here we see Simon Otis at the same time talking about difference articulated from a standpoint and of the human condition. And this difference and accommodation of difference is at the heart of several articulations of indigenous humanisms in literature. Difference not just between communities, nations, and political standpoints, but difference within all our relations. Indigenous humanisms extend solidarity to other than human forms and more than humans. As the writer Daniel Heath Justice's work, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, can be read as a work that incisively theorizes indigenous humanism from the Native American standpoint. He critiques the dominant stories on humanity as deeply entrenched in settler colonial societies, as the remnants of Enlightenment philosophy and Abrahamic traditions. In questions posed and theorized as chapters, how do we learn to be human? How do we behave as good relatives? And how do we become good ancestors? He offers an expansive understanding of humanism through readings of Native American stories. It is an understanding that does not limit the category of person solely to the human, as Justice writes. And he also writes about ideas of kinship with the non-human world and networks of relations. I quote, multiplicity is inherent in kinship. Good relations require acknowledgement and, importantly, mindful accommodation of difference. So the idea here is not of human exclusivity or centrality, but of human responsibility. Now, given a conception of humanism based on kinship, where the human exists in equation and does not occupy the center, one might ask, why use the term humanism at all? Humanism still remains a much contested word that still privileges the humanity of certain populations alone. And there are, again, two concerns while framing indigenous humanisms from the UK. First is a co-option within Eurocentric understandings of humanism that is still dominant in educational institutions and discourse in general. And second, an appropriation within far-right definitions of indigeneity and indigenous humanisms in the UK and Europe, and also a precarious fallback on the all lives matter discourse. we cannot even call it a discourse. As Justice explains why the need for this complexity, there needs to be complexity about how humanity is framed, complexity of humanism through multiple stories. He writes, complexity challenges manipulation. When reframed and reasoned through indigenous discourse, it expands the way we think of the human condition. Now, this complexity of language that Daniel Heath Justice talks about through his reading of Native American stories, it is not a reading of complexity that should be limited to language, but also needs to reflect the transpiring geopolitical complexity of the present and that of the human future. In her article titled A Self-Governing Literature, Wani writer Alexis Wright recognizes a fundamental query of what she terms as the emergency century. And the query is how humans will address what the earth needs. And the novel, like the world of a novel, the Swan Book, overturns these geopolitical boundaries. And similarly, in her article, A Self-Governing Literature, her way of imagining human reliance to think about the climate crisis pushes to question the economic and philosophical divides as between the global north and the south, but rather to think of intersections of class as well as indigeneity within these locales, especially Australia and its global south neighbors. Hers is an imagination that has already accounted the climate refugee crisis that is on foot. Whether in Eastern India and Bangladesh, Pakistan, or in Australia, the particularity of relationship to the remembered earth that Mohammed talks about, right, and wrote about, is becoming untenable. Forced displacement that began with settler colonialisms and colonialisms around the world and continue as part of the crisis is not the only disorientation to contemporary indigenous communities. They also face absences, fast disappearing salmon trails or seed varieties or forests. And they are also the witnesses of a dislocation of the elemental coordinates of what was previously a landmass or ice or a mountain. So Wright's questions demand the dual work of a thinking together about ethical engagement with the land and planet globally, and also the political affirmation of indigenous peoples and laws of country. To frame planetary questions that are cognizant of existing social, political, and economic disparities is for her the responsibility of contemporary writers. She does not limit this responsibility to indigenous writers, but links affinities and resonances from global literatures. She responds to Robert Macfarlane, Amitav Ghosh, Mahmoud Darwish, or I even add Daniel Heath Justice, asking what makes a good ancestor. And each of these writers have similarly framed this question in their respective works. So can this question become a link then to seek further affinities to build comparative genealogies of land ethics, centering and starting from the place and perspectives of indigenous writers, and how they might have informed or continue to inform responsibilities to land in the UK and Europe? And I'll finish with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Jacqueline Brown has recently graduated from the University of Oxford, completing her Masters of Studies in English, 1900 to present. Her research interests lie in the post-colonial and Indigenous literatures with a focus on eco-criticism. Let's all welcome Jacqueline.
Thank you so much. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose land I am speaking from today, as a guest, a Korean migrant whose place here has been enabled by colonialism. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Indigenous peoples present. I recognise that I'm trying to amplify Indigenous voices in my research, but have a long way to go methodologically, as I've learned over the past 2 days. Wanyi First Nations author Alexis Wright, whom Ananya has talked about already, has spoken at great lengths about her desire for her novels to aesthetically function as an accurate replica of Indigenous reality and country. This is prompted by ongoing histories of colonialism and the hauntings of the national myth Terra Nullius, Nobody's Land, resulting in the, to quote Wright, the endless battle about who owns the narrative of this country and who has the right to speak for it. According to Indigenous Australian scholars Bruce Pascoe, Tyson Yunkaporta, and Margot Neal, country is a particular spatial and temporal unit which defines the interconnected ecological webs of kinship between all things within a specific place, from people, animals, plants, landforms, and dreaming, designating the ongoing spiritual creations which bring country into being. Such a unit transcends Western divisions of past, present, and future, as all times, unresolved, exist at once and continue to unfold. Indeed, rather than linear or cyclical, Indigenous ecological time is formed through the sophisticated patterning of the natural world and its rhythmed events, unique to each country and First Nation group. The deep knowledges and laws of country, an archive or ancient library, are accessed via equally interconnected stories that, like country itself, continue to be made and remade with each renewed performance across generations. A traditions that Wright's novels participate in as a spinning helix of many strands of stories of all times that are intertwined culturally to place. Unlike the distinction between the real or material and the spiritual or supernatural in magical realist novels, Wright's novels are grounded in the complexities of country, encompassing all times and realities at once. Such cosmodiversity cannot fully be comprehended through Western dichotomies of ancient, new, magical, real, human, non-human. Thus, Wright offers a model of ecological time that Western literary studies have yet to find language to explain. Many studies of Wright revert to non-linear and its ascribed negative relation to the assumed normativity of Western temporal frameworks. Magical realist is also used, reinforcing a Western ontological hegemony that is inaccurate because Wright doesn't see her novels as containing supernatural or fantastic elements. An examination of how country and ecological time are negotiated in Wright's novel forms would serve to rectify the inadequate engagement with time and form in eco-criticism and studies of Indigenous peoples. Along with the way that studies of time and form have tended to assume the universality of Western and anthropocentric epistemologies, eco-criticism and studies of Indigenous peoples have often fallen back on the language of timelessness to describe the natural world and Indigenous peoples respectively. Such a negative construction gives normative primacy to Western epistemologies and linear temporal frameworks of modernity and progress as the standard by which other spatio-temporal categories are measured. It has also contributed to misconceptions of the natural world and Indigenous peoples as ahistorical or belonging to a romanticized primordial past. More recent eco-critical studies have attempted to move away from the designation of nature as timeless. Rob Nixon utilizes slow violence to describe human-induced climate change, while Rob McFarlane, Elizabeth Dellery, and Jennifer Wenzel use deep time and planetary scales. Yet there is still an implicit separation of the human from the environmental, unfamiliar in many Indigenous ontologies. Rather than reinforcing Western standards of literary criticism by focusing on human characters or plot, as much analysis of Wright does, I wish to focus on the ecological chronotopes that make apparent one-year ecological time. As theorized by Mikhail Bakhtin, in novels, chronotopes are the spatial and temporal indicators fused into one carefully thought out concrete whole that shape the novel and the reader's temporal experience of it. Wright's chronotopes, the rainbow serpent in Carpentaria and eucalyptus tree in Swan Book, function as access points and structural anchors through which readers comprehend Indigenous realities, connecting all times and narrative layers from, quote, time immemorial, by returning with every storyline and climax through performative music-like variations, exploding expectations of past, present, future, plotted narrative, and causal development. In Carpentaria, set in a
Recording stopped.
which traces the actions of ecological ancestral beings, colonial
Recording
history,
in progress.
and multinational mining company exploiting country and the local Indigenous communities in the Gulf of Carpentaria. The rainbow serpent, existing across many First Nation cosmologies, shapes the novel's events. In Swan Book, set in a future Australia ravaged by climate wars, the tree, inspired by the story of Wright's great-grandmother, allows us to follow the memories of a mute girl, Oblivia, whose traumatic survival of a gang rape parallels the survival of country, ecologically violated by human-induced climate crises, in an examination of the ongoing physical and cultural displacement of country and Indigenous peoples, which extends across time. Together, they reveal the expansive nature of Wanyi ecological temporality and reminds us that Indigenous storytelling traditions are themselves ongoing, continuing into the present, just as country is full of regenerating cycles. For timing, I'll focus primarily on carpentaria, stepping out my analysis in 3 stages. 1, by looking at how Wright aesthetically welcomes us into Indigenous cosmologies by setting up ecological time through her chronotopes from the opening. 2, by examining how the narrator negotiates these chronotopes through a self-conscious orality that enacts ecological time and transforms the novel into a performance. And 3, by asking where Wright locates us through these chronotopes that, in the process of reading, exist across all times into our present, encouraging us to consider how the future of climate change is our present. Rob Nixon and Amitav Ghosh argue that the novel form, with its apparently gradual temporal unfolding and small-scale evolutions, is unable to account for the temporalities of deep time and climate change. Both turn instead to lyric poetry and epic. Bakhtin makes a similar temporal division between the classical epic, a past form, and the novel, seemingly inherently modern, in theorizing chronotopes. Yet Carpentaria and Swan Book transcend these temporal distinctions, ecological, formal, novel, and epic, because, quote, the everyday contemporary Indigenous story world is epic, evinced in Wright's layering of Wanyi ancient sagas in her fictionalized present. This complex temporal experience confused early readers. The London Review of Books stated that the novel's contractions of and jumps in time do not always make it an accessible book. The Times more scathingly criticized the long-winded roundabout accounts of complete non-events, suggesting one needs a mental machete to hack your way stubbornly through thick jungles of digression and vast swamps of irrelevance, to then come round in a gigantic circle. Marnie Hughes Warrington offers a productive way of navigating this temporal relationship. When first listening to Elder Auntie Anne Martin, like early readers of Wright, Hughes Warrington struggled to make sense. I searched for a linear order, a spatiotemporal scale to slide up and down, a before and an after, a cause and its ethical effects. She found comprehension through the ecological dots, telling dreaming stories of what it means to be part of and to nourish country, in ways that know no boundaries between past, present, and future, and between entities. Whilst this captures how the ecological is tied to the temporal, in both existing as interconnected webs, Wright's novels also add a formal element to this relationship. Her dots or chronotopes construct no boundaries between times, entities, plot lines. Although using chronotope, the meaning I give differs from Bakhtin in that there is a third dimension to the spatio-temporal relationship, that of place and country. Because Carpentaria draws on oral traditions, I want to read out to you the opening of the novel. The ancestral serpent came down from the stars, laden with its own creative enormity. It moved graciously. If you had been watching with the eyes of a bird hovering in the sky far above the ground, looking down at the serpent's wet body, glistening from the sunlight, long before man was a creature who could contemplate the next moment in time. It came down those billions of years ago to crawl on its heavy belly all around the wet clay soils in the Gulf of Carpentaria. Picture the creative serpent, scoring deep into, scouring down through the slippery underground of the mudflats, leaving in its wake the thunder of tunnels. The giant serpent continues to live deep down under the ground, They say its being is porous. It permeates everything. It is all around in the atmosphere and is attached to the lives of the river people like skin. Imagine the serpent's breathing rhythms as the tide flows inland, edging towards the gorges of an ancient limestone plateau covered with rattling grasses dried yellow from the prevailing winds. Then, with outward breath, the tide turns and the serpent flows back to its own circulating mass of shallow waters. It seasonally shifts its tracks according to its own mood, a river that spurns human endeavor in one dramatic gesture, jilting a lover who has never really been known, as it did to the frontier town built on its banks in the hectic heyday of colonial vigor. In one moment, during a wet season early in the last century, the town lost its harbor waters when the river simply decided to change course, to bypass it by several kilometers. Now the waterless port survives with more or less nothing to do. Wright refuses here to engage in Western temple constructions of epochs or eras in describing the serpent. One, because such times have not ended, and two, because we are being taken to long before humans could contemplate the next moment in time, and thus to impose such Western temporal frameworks would be anachronistic. Perhaps this contributes to disorientation for Western readers. However, it seems clock time and the limitations of English, bound by past, present, future tense, are the source of disorientation, not ecological time. With past tense, came down, alongside present tense, continues to live, is porous, is attached. Instead, ecological temporality is erratic, shifting seasonally with the serpent's rhythmed events, seasons not for arbitrary periods a year, but instead unique to the climatic dynamics of the tropical Gulf that are immeasurable and undetermined, some seasons days, some years. However, the serpent's dramatic mood is not simply metaphorical. You can feel the almost visceral tactility of this opening through its orality, the serpent's heaviness, its wet body, and the wet clay soils. It's real and not magically real. As with its creative enormity and spurning gestures, Wright gives sentience to the serpent in the reminder to readers that country is a living, thinking, feeling web that connects all other sentient beings, from birds, land, people, and colonial settlers, whose history it can accommodate yet also spurns, by an ecological rhythm of all times. So how does Wright anchor us? Whilst often analysed in isolation, this opening returns in all 14 chapters, in variations replicating oral transmission, and in Wright's words, a story told over multiple days, giving her language a musicality that becomes a kind of performance of country. But what is the effect on the reader? By bringing us back to this opening again and again, it exists, although in a past reading moment, in the reader's experiential present alongside each new narrative layer. The novel enacts the collapsing of past, present, future through the reader, who experiences the chronotope not just within the text, but in their mind, present, and memory, as the chronotope jumps out of the novel's temporal framing. Heightened by moments that, like in the opening, where the narrator's imperative verbs direct the reader to picture and imagine the serpent, the notion of the present is complicated. Despite taking place from time immemorial, the opening is enacted across time to the moment of reading in a web of communication between narrator, country, and reader. But Wright also holds us at a distance. There are moments explicitly where she says the character Will and the serpent have secrets alike and then refuses to disclose them. Even in this opening, Wright only allows us to enter the world from a bird's perspective, creating a sense of ecological connection whilst also keeping us far away from the serpent and Gulf cosmologies. At times, this can be frustrating for Western readers trained to dig for meaning, truth, and knowledge. But as Rita Felsky critiques critique for attempting to mine a text for meaning, Wright also explicitly in essays and implicitly in her novels tells us that we should not be mining Indigenous works for some core sacred knowledge, of course with its environmental implications. Although many have spoken of the incomprehensible scale of deep time and the planetary, Wright seems to offer solace in the notion that country can never be entirely comprehended or theorized to outsiders through Western thinking, just as post-colonial theory speaks of the incommensurable and untranslatable. As she questions in Carpentaria, quote, "Can someone who did not grow up in a place know the moment of climatic change better than they know themselves?" As this implication of climate change suggests, through her incorporation of country and ecological time, Wright engages with discourses around ecological crises and the Earth's futurity in the reader's present. For ecological time not only structures the internal world of the novel and country, but also extends beyond the novel framework to the reader's reality and memory. In a departure from recent eco-critics, Wright presents climate change not as an entirely new phenomenon or the next chapter of modernity, but instead suggests, particularly in this opening, that country has always unpredictably changed. This fluidity in the state of the climate is reflected in the erratic and unfixed nature of ecological time and in the dynamic evolution of Indigenous knowledges to accommodate these processes. This is not to quell the need to act upon human-induced climate crises. Rather, it is to shift the perspective that the natural world is wholly passive to human action, and that we must rely on new empirical scientific discoveries to solve climate change, both of which reinforce Western epistemologies and linear temporalities. The Swan Book concludes, "You had to hear these soothsaying creatures creating glimpses of a new internationally dimensional language about global warming and the changing climates for this land. Really listen hard to what they were saying." Luckily, through Wright's novels and her invitation to listen hard to country as guests, they are still speaking to us. And in our current moment, it seems more imperative than ever to do so. Thank you.